Speaker is Davide Cortinovis from the University of Trento in Italy. The title of his talk is Category-selectivity again, Hand-selective visual areas support action-related behavioral goals. Thank you.
So, hi everyone, I'm Davide, and today I'm going to talk about the dimensions underlying category selectivity in visual cortex. Okay. So, the objects that we encounter in our daily life can be represented as single points in a metaphorical multidimensional object space. And this multidimensional space must be somehow mapped onto the two-dimensional cortical surface. So how does this mapping work? Well, different proposals have stressed the role of different dimensions, and these dimensions span the entire continuum from low-level principles such as eccentricity to shape to higher-level semantic dimensions like animacy and reward size. And the combinations of these dimensions lead to the emergence of classic category-selective patterns. And with category selectivity, I mean that specific areas are selected for specific categories of objects, such as faces, tools, body parts, and so on. However, all of these dimensions cannot explain another consistent arrangement of category selective areas, and specifically the presence of hand selectivity in the left lateral occipitotemporal cortex, or OTC, and most importantly, the fact that hand selectivity neighbors and partial overlaps with tool selectivity. And now, if we think about hands and tools, we see that they are obviously quite distinct object categories, so they vary along many dimensions. So they have distinct shape, distinct material properties. One is animate, the other one is inanimate. Instead, what is common between the two is the fact that they can be used as end effectors. That is, they are both used to modify the state of the external environment. And there is already preliminary evidence that show that this sort of end effector or action-related dimension is mapped onto the regions that show hand and tool selectivity. So this suggests a possible new way in which the multidimensional object space is mapped onto visual cortex. It is the role of action. And indeed, in my work, we wanted to test the role of these dimensions in explaining part of the category selective patterns in OTC. So to study that, we conducted a series of fMRI experiments. Here I present the results for the first one. And in these experiments, we presented to participants a series of object categories. So we have faces, whole bodies, hands, tools, manipulable and non-manipulable objects. And the idea is that there are two main dimensions underlying this stimulus set. So one is animacy, body parts versus inanimate objects. And the other dimension is action. So each category is associated with a different degree of action-related information that we validated behaviorally. And this action-related information is highest and shared between hands and tools, because these are the end effector objects. So first of all, we visualized on the whole brain surface the selectivity patterns for each of the 6 object categories. And here we can see the results. So in the left lateral, the left lateral OTC, we see a sort of action-related topographic organization with an from dorsal posterior to ventral anterior. We see an activation for bodies, this cluster in orange, then a big activation for hands that can be dissociated from the activation for bodies in yellow, then an activation for tools in dark blue, and you can see that the hand cluster and the two clusters overlap. Then we see a smaller activation for manipulable objects and no activation for non-manipulable objects. Then in the ventral OTC, we observe a second hand-selective cluster, which will be the left lateralized fusiform body area, but it's selective for hands, not for bodies. And more medially, we see kind of the opposite action gradient with a big cluster for non-manipulable objects, smaller for manipulable, and even smaller for tools. So we see a kind of opposite action gradient between lateral and ventral OTC. And to better characterize this action gradient, we ran a vector-pairwise analysis. And in this analysis, we basically chose 2 points in visual cortex. One was very medial, and one very dorsal and posterior. And between these 2 points, we draw a vector. So this vector passes through major anatomical landmarks, and along this vector we generated a series of partial overlapping spheres. These spheres were our ROIs, and from the ROIs we extracted the selectivity profile and the multivariate patterns, as I will explain in a moment. So first of all, the univariate. So what's happening here? On each point on the x-axis is a sphere, so from medial to dorsal posterior. And on the y-axis, we have the beta values, so how much each category activates the corresponding sphere. And we can see that in ventral OTC, we observe in all medial regions an activation for all inanimate objects, especially for large non-manipulable objects. Instead, in more laterally, we observe the fusiform face area and small but consistent activation for hands. More laterally, so in the lateral OTC, we observe the selectivity for tools, then selectivity for hands, and in some spheres, the two selectivities overlap, and more posterior, we see in orange the activation for bodies. So, first take-home message, we did find an action-related topography at the level of univariate results, so with opposite action gradient in ventral and lateral OTC. Then we confirm dissociable body and hand selectivity, not only lateral but also in ventral. And if you notice from the map I showed before, the tool selectivity is kind of sandwiched between the lateral and ventral hand selective clusters. Then we were also interested in the representations behind these category selective patterns. So we take the same vector. Instead of having the selectivity profile, we have the multivariate patterns for the 6 categories. And we correlated the vector with 3 models, capturing different dimensions. So we have the aspect ratio, which is a measure of shape. Then we have animacy and action. And these were generated behaviorally, so by asking participants to generate these models. And here we can see the results. So in VOTC, we see that there is the vector is the same. On the y-axis, we have, in this case, the correlation with the 3 models. And we can see that in ventral, it's basically just animacy in red. In lateral, instead, the action model increases, and in some regions, which are the regions that are hand selective, we see the presence of both animacy and action, and to a lesser extent, shape. And to better visualize these results, we also averaged ventral and lateral OTC together. So we have ventral, just animacy, and lateral, all 3 together, especially action and animacy. So also the level of multivariate, we find an action-related representation, especially in the hand-selective clusters in lateral OTC. And action dimension is actually independent from the shape dimension. Finally, we also we also ran the same analysis on a series of neural networks, specifically topographic deep artificial neural networks. I don't have time to go into the details, but if you want, you can check this paper when published on Neuron. They have amazing code. And basically, this network just implements a kind of spatial loss, so a biological constraint, so that units that fire in a similar way must fall close in a physical simulated cortical space. And thanks to this simulation, we can run the same analysis that we ran in visual cortex, and that's what we did. So basically, we run both univariate and multivariate analysis, and what we find is that across these analysis, we see organization based on mostly on animacy. So for example, here, all inanimate objects fall in a part of this space. All body parts fall in another part. So this is univariate, but also multivariate, so body parts versus inanimate objects, but there is no action-related organization as we find in visual cortex. So while we see this action-related organization in visual cortex, neural networks can capture an animacy dissociation, but not an action-related organization. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank my, my group and my collaborators from the University of Trento, and you can come to my poster this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Anyone in the audience wants to come up to the microphone? And we have a couple of questions on the system. Just a sec. Is tool graspability a factor to explain your results?
Sorry, can you?
Is tool graspability a factor to explain your results?
No, the sort of end effector action-related dimension cannot be reduced to graspability because we have the distinction between tools, which are the end effector objects, and manipulable objects, which are graspable objects. And there is no overlap between hands and manipulable objects, and also there is a representational distinction between the two object categories. So it's really end effector and not graspability.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Ability to use tools expertise may affect brain activation, for instance, musical tools. How do you expect it to affect space activation, action space activation?
Well, there is some evidence that, for example, if you if you're expert at using tools, actually this overlap is less pronounced, but mostly these experiments don't really distinguish between tools, the way you define them, like end effector objects versus manipulable objects. So, for example, musical instruments would be actually manipulable objects, not tools, because tools are really things that you use to act on other stuff. So musical instruments would be something different.
Thank you very much. If we don't have any other questions from the audience, no, we'll thank the speaker again and